Iran and Russia are ready. Is this the beginning of the end of US hegemony in the world? That's a question mark, because I've been predicting that for a very long time. And I've been wishing for it, praying for it for so long, I cannot bring myself to state it as a fact. But the reason why there's reason for optimism is that this is now a credible question. All of my life, American hegemony has been the reality. Even though there were two sides in the Cold War, one never felt that the United States had become a paper tiger. When the Chinese leader Mao Zedong described them as that in the 1960s, it clearly was not true. Now, the United States is still a tiger, but it's an old tiger. Many of its teeth have fallen out. It is rotten from the inside, evident in everyday life in the United States of America. Moreover, there are younger, leaner, fitter tigers out there in the world, and they probably have sharper teeth. We'll soon know what the Iranian response to the foul murder of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, what the Lebanese response will be to a series of assassinations of its leading figures and the quiet murder of dozens, if not scores, of innocent civilians along the way. We'll soon know what Israel has got by way of a response to the response. And we'll soon know how far the United States of America is prepared to go to back its savage attack dog, the head of which is the ruthless murderer Benjamin Netanyahu. There are many questions, therefore, in this statement, and we are going to tease them out this afternoon. The truth is, though, the fact we're even discussing this credibly, the end of American empire, the end of American hegemony, is a measure of how far we have traveled. The truth is, the world has changed utterly. The balance of power in the world has shifted so considerably that if I'm asking these questions, you can be sure they're asking them in Moscow, in Beijing, and in Tehran. You can be sure they're asking them in the bowels of the Situation Room of the presidency of Joseph Biden. You can be sure that those who really call the shots in the United States are just as much in questioning mode about what lies ahead for US power, for US hegemony. If you're interested in these matters, you've come to the right place. It's Have It Out with Galloway.com. Come back and see me on the wall next time you have the chance. It's Have It Out with Galloway. Come and have a go if you think you're hard enough. Elijah J Magnier is a veteran war correspondent and political analyst with more than 35 years of experience covering decades of war in the Middle East and North Africa. And he joins me now. Elijah, I was just making the point that we'll soon know. What is it that you think we will soon know?
We will soon see the retaliation of Iran that inevitably is coming because the leader of the Islamic Revolution, Sayyid Ali Khamenei, ordered the armed forces, as he is the commander of all Iranian armed forces, to prepare for the attack and the defense. So he is prepared for a potential retaliation of Israel, to the Iranian retaliation, to the Israeli violation of international laws, and the assassination of a VIP guest in the capital, Tehran. That is inevitable. It is going to happen. It's just a question of time. And we will see a retaliation coming from the Lebanese resistance against the violation of these Israeli international laws and attacking a sovereign country, bombing the capital and killing not only the Hezbollah commander, but several civilians and wounding more than 80. That is inevitable. And on the other hand, we have seen something extremely new in Gaza and in the West Bank, when for the first time since 2005, there was a suicide attack in the Israeli economic capital, Tel Aviv, which means that the Palestinians have decided that international laws is no longer working. The US hegemony is not applicable over Israel, is very weak, cannot stop war. All the Americans are no longer a partner to be able to strike peace in the Middle East. And now they are returning to the old method, as Israel has announced there is no longer a possibility of two-state solutions. And because the Russians were not defeated in Ukraine, because Russia is not divided into many states, as the Americans promised our European leaders at the beginning of the war, we see a serious challenge of the US hegemony, and we see that China, the global South, and many countries today are no longer willing to be submitted to the US indefinite sanctions whenever there is any country that is unwilling to be under the West umbrella and become part of the Western club.
You mentioned there the shoe that hasn't dropped yet, China. It's perfectly evident from tracking the flights and the military supply and resupply, the reported sighting of S-400 anti-aircraft batteries, which Russia has sold to Iran, and we know the deterrent capability that they represent. It's perfectly evident from the visit of the Russian defense minister to Tehran recently that Iran and Russia are acting as one. It's a little more difficult to discern what role, if any, China will play in the coming struggle to defeat American hegemony. Are they just following their traditional, somewhat Confucian approach of walking quietly whilst fashioning a big stick? Or should we read something else into their relative quietude?
So far, China did not take any aggressive initiative toward the West, and in particular toward the United States. On the contrary, the Americans are building more coalition around China, and it's increasing the military presence, encouraging Taiwan to be more aggressive and have more aggressive attitude toward China. Therefore, watching what's happening between Russia, that is fighting 50 nations that are planning in Ramstein, Germany, against Russia, using the Ukrainian soldiers as proxies, and how Russia managed to hold the ground and challenge the West, and watching what's happening in the Middle East, China is not passive. On the contrary, it is active because, first of all, the message was not only directed from the West towards Russia, but was directed mainly toward China, because China is a giant, an economic giant, and represents a serious threat to the US hegemony. Not the military, but the economic hegemony. And if we tackle the economy, we defeat the military, which means a de-dollarization will end the US hegemony over the world and will force the Americans to recall all the soldiers and the officers that are spread in more than 751 or 52 military bases around the globe. By defeating the dollar, it is the defeat to the US imperialism and control over the world. This is what China is doing today. And this is why China is supporting Iran and supporting Russia, but without breaking up with the West and without challenging overtly the West, but keeping rather a low profile in the support toward China and the West Asia, but challenging the West economically. So when the Americans are threatening China by saying we can stop the selling of semiconductors, the Americans are admitting the fact that China exports 60% of the semiconductors worldwide and import 60% and export 30%. So it has 30% of internal usage. Therefore, putting sanctions on China in the semiconductors forced China to invest billions of dollars to be independent, exactly like Russia, exactly like Iran. And this is where the coalition is non-verbally declared, but everybody is supporting within this axis of anti-US hegemony. They seeing what the other side is in need of, like you rightly said. The Americans, the Russians supplied the Iranian with defense system, and this is why the Islamic leader Sayyid Ali Khamenei said to the military, prepare for the defense. And this is where the role of Russia was crucial. And also Iran is supporting Russia in other means. We're talking about missiles and drones, which is in the interest of Iran not to see Russia defeated. And it's an interest of China to see Iran and Russia prevailing and to see the Americans engage fully in the war in the Middle East, where they don't find a way out.
We'll come back to the Middle East in just a minute, but let me take you to Washington. Do you think Joe Biden has any idea that any of this is happening, or that we can credibly believe that laughing gas Harris is in any sense a war leader preparing as commander-in-chief, acting commander-in-chief, to command the 1/3 of the entire American Navy, which is now in the Persian Gulf or in the Eastern Mediterranean? Who's running the show from the American point of view, do you think?
I think watching the Americans' media and intellectual and strategic study centers, I don't think Joe Biden is aware what is happening in his room or around him. Therefore, who is leading the US today? It's the establishment. We have a Secretary of State, we have a Secretary of Defense, and we have a team of people who are leading America. This is why we see a very weak approach from America toward the Middle East, and we see a very weak approach from America toward China. Instead of attacking China and provoking China into an economic war that can spread and can have different consequences, like China in the Philippines, for example. China today is challenging the Americans in the Philippines. Therefore, we see China is not sitting and watching and waiting for the Americans to surround it. This is where we see Joe Biden going into a different wars without an end. I mean, to be fair, since the Americans went to war to Vietnam and to Afghanistan and to Iraq and to Libya and to Syria, they failed in all these wars. So even with someone who is clever and intelligent in the White House, is the end game and the result is more or less the same. Having someone like Joe Biden who is not aware all the time of his surrounding, he's certainly not aware of how to lead the world. This is why Kamala Harris did not show any political maturity during the ruling of Joe Biden as his vice president, and who certainly did not demonstrate any political knowledge during her campaign. Again, we will see a US administration running the United States, which is at the end of the day not a bad thing, as America is in decline, and it's better if there are many people responsible for this decline.
One of the powers in that establishment, you've referred to him by title, is Antony Blinken. He's back in the region. He's talking with the Netanyahu government. He may even be planning to try and overthrow Netanyahu on behalf of other members of the Tel Aviv gang. Who knows? What's your take on his avowed intent of trying to bring about a ceasefire, trying to avert the wider war that you and I are discussing here?
For the first time, we see Antony Blinken ending a meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu, Israeli Prime Minister, after 2.5 to 3 hours, without coming out and blaming Hamas for the failure of the negotiations. Normally, this is what he does. We see Antony Blinken incapable of putting pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu, rather always traveling to the Middle East to see what the Israelis are in need of in terms of weapons and how they can support the Israelis by protecting the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and trying to intercept missiles and drones that are launched against Israel to stop the war on Gaza and invest so much money instead of putting pressure on the Israelis to stop their genocide in Gaza against the Palestinians and in the West Bank. So Antony Blinken has asked indirectly from Iran, along with other 7 nations, to wait and not to retaliate immediately, to give a chance to the peace talk. Perhaps they managed to convince Netanyahu to stop the war. But Netanyahu came out and said no. He imposed the new conditions, and he said he is not in a hurry, and he wants to remain in Gaza and to continue the war anytime he wants. And he wants the release of the prisoners and the captives and then regain the war. So what Blinken is trying to do, as he has asked from Iran a delay before retaliating, he is aware of the result in Doha. Now he's asking further delay because he said that the other talks will start in Egypt. Now, I don't understand what he's going to manage to get out in Egypt, what he failed to reach in Doha, as Netanyahu is imposing conditions that are unacceptable to remain in Gaza, to have the say where to deport the Palestinian prisoners who he wants to exchange with, to control the Nestarim corridor that divides the north and the south, to remain in the Philadelphia corridor with the border with Egypt, to control anyone who is returning home from the south, where they are internally displaced, to the north, and then maintaining a force in Gaza and have the full control of any time he wants to send his troop to start a war again. He's not talking about a lasting or permanent ceasefire. He's talking about a potential ceasefire in phase 2, which means that after the release of all the captives, so he can regain the war and destroy what remains in Gaza. These are his intentions because, first, the Knesset is on holiday, the Israeli parliament, for 3 months. Therefore, he doesn't have any accountability where he didn't have accountability before. Second, the Americans are not asking him to stop the war and stopping the supply of weapons. If the Americans were serious, they would stop the supply of weapons, which is something not only they have not done, but they have increased the weapon and the financial supply from $3.5 billion. They've added an additional 26, and now they added even 20 billion to supply the Israelis with F-15 Eagle capable of bombing Iran, Yemen, and Iraq. So this kind of encouragement for more war, and then on the other hand, asking for to a negotiation to stop the war are incompatible. This double standard doesn't work anymore. The world is watching the incapability of the US to impose its hegemony on the bully of the Middle East that they have created, that is Israel, and to stop the war there.
This incompatibility, wild incompatibility indeed, in these two stated objectives, which begs the question, which is the tail and which is the dog? If the United States was in control of Israel, as surely it is capable of being, for the reasons you just adumbrated, then it would be able to order a ceasefire acceptable to all parties. Does that therefore mean that they're merely pretending to look for a ceasefire? They actually want the war to continue? And do they really therefore want Iran and the Lebanese resistance not to retaliate? Or is it all this just a very elaborate game for them?
I think both can be compared to a wild dog in their behavior. But I think what's happening here is the Israelis and the Americans are both in full agreement in destroying and eliminating Hamas. And they are in full agreement to destroy Hezbollah. The problem is these are wishful thinking, that the Americans are more realistic than the Israelis, and they have realized for the protection of Israel that the Israeli army is incapable of achieving these objectives. This is why Donald Trump came out and he said that Israel army is incapable of fighting alone on different fronts, and that if he is elected, this is what he's going to do. Apart what he added, that he will help Israel to enlarge its territory because Israel is very tiny and small. So we see today with Joe Biden, the Americans meet the Israelis, but they are more aware of the incapability of the strongest Israeli army, that's the strongest in the Middle East and one of the strongest in the world, to, with 180,000 professional soldiers and 380,000 reservists, defeat the Palestinian resistance in 364 square kilometers. And because of that, the Americans are very good in trying to achieve in peacetime what they have failed in military means. And what the Americans are proposing to the Israelis, let us stop the war, reach a ceasefire, because the Americans have elections to run. And they are afraid of losing votes for the Democrats as long as they continue showing that they're not doing enough to stop the war. So what the Americans want is to stop the war temporarily now, and then through the supply of food, supply of material to reconstruct Gaza, because Gaza needs between $80 to $100 billion. Who's going to pay the money? Who's going to remove all the debris that they need several years to do? Who's going to reconstruct? Who's going to pay? All that represent elements and tools to put pressure on the Palestinian resistance. The problem is that neither the Americans nor the Israelis found an alternative for the Palestinian resistance in Gaza. Of course, the Israelis tried to turn the inhabitants against the resistance, but they've done it in a way that they've destroyed everything to the point that there is not one soul in Gaza that is not against the Israelis and want revenge. Not only from the Israelis, but mainly from those who are supplying weapons to the Israelis and continue covering the Israeli back at the United Nations, at the ICJ, International Court of Justice, and at the International Criminal Court to protect Israel for all its crimes.
An outstanding tour of the horizon, Elijah Magnier, war correspondent supreme. Thank you for that. Let's go to the video wall. That's the unique feature of Have It Out with Galloway. You can see the people waiting patiently to ask the questions that are on their mind. Let's go to London. First, Matt Robinson in London. Matt, what's on your mind?
How you doing, George? Thanks for inviting me on the show. I was very interested in your question with regards to China supporting Iran and Russia. But what I find interesting is, do you think that the USA, the European powers and Israel have really thought this through about fronting up against Iran? Because we know Iran have, what's it, about, including reservists, 1 million soldiers, over 4,500, 5,000 tanks. They have the support of Russia, Russian weapons, undoubtedly Chinese weapons. Do you think they've really thought this through?
Well, that's what I was trying to get at with Elijah Magnier. It seems so obvious to me that they have not thought it through that I'm beginning to doubt myself as to whether or not it's as obvious as I think it is. Let's knock down one or two of the points you just made there. There's a lot of territory between Iran and Tel Aviv, so the Iranian soldiers will not be deployed. Of course, in hand-to-hand fighting in Iran, any invader of Iran would have no chance at all. But most of those soldiers will have to sit out what is about to happen. This will be an aerial war. It'll be missiles, ballistic missiles, some that we've never seen before, and some, and let's hope it doesn't come to that, of entirely unconventional nature. The Israeli response, ditto. They're not going to invade Iran. So it will not be two armies, it will be two air forces, space forces that will be engaged in this. On the northern front, on the other hand, I'd put quite a lot of money on the likelihood of ground invasion of occupied Palestine by the Lebanese resistance into the Galilee, by the Lebanese resistance and their allies and the government of Syria to retake the Golan Heights, for example. After all, if Russia were to help Syria recover the Golan Heights, they would merely be implementing international law. It would be an entirely legal act to recapture the Golan Heights and return them to the country that owns them, which everyone recognizes is the Syrian Arab Republic. So that's something I'd keep my eye on, and that's something where ground forces may very well be involved in quite historic and epic battles. But I still, I get that the United States, the empire, including Britain, has made a monster in Israel, like Dr. Frankenstein made the famous Frankenstein monster. I'm very well aware that once you've made a monster, well, it's a monster, and it's no longer under your control. Except that if the United States turned off the tap, the financial, the war materiel, the diplomatic, and other force that they deploy constantly, decade after decade, in defense of Israeli crimes, that eventually the Frankenstein monster would break down and perish. It would not be able to continue being a monster indefinitely, unless with recourse to what we now know for certain. We always knew, but now we have the confirmation of the US president himself, who passed on to Tehran a warning that Israel may use tactical nuclear weapons in its response to Iran's response. That's the first confirmation ever from an American president that Israel possesses entirely illegally acquired, uninspected, unregulated by any international authority, a fleet of nuclear weapons. But if Israel were to use nuclear weapons against Iran, first of all, Iran might use nuclear weapons back. You may say, but Iran has not declared that it has nuclear weapons. But neither has Israel declared that it has nuclear weapons. I'd, again, put quite a bit of money on the likelihood of Iran having a nuclear deterrent. So where does that leave us? That leaves us with a nuclear winter over the entire Middle East and West Asia, leaves us with radiation sickness like Hiroshima, Nagasaki, like nuclear reactor disasters, to the power of 1,000 over friend and foe of the United States. After all, if this balloon really goes up, many of the United States' pet Arab states will no longer exist, and neither will their oil and gas facilities, and neither will a thing move in the Straits of Hormuz, in the Red Sea, in the Suez Canal. Nothing will move. You'll be lucky to get a gallon of petrol at $1,000 a gallon. Never mind a few dollars or a few pounds. The economic, strategic impact on the region and thereafter the world of this balloon really going up is very, very hard to understand why nobody is putting their foot on the brake and stopping this now before it gets any more serious. Thanks for the call. Stay in London. Neil Harris is up next. What's on your mind, Neil?
Yeah, I just wanted to speculate on at what point would all this mayhem be triggered, which is basically what we're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. Well, when Iran and the resistance arc respond to the crimes that were committed against them recently, then Israel will have to decide how it deals with that. If it deals with that by way of further escalation, then we're into the cycle I've just described. And we're into the, not just possibility, but probability of Iran's friends coming to the defense of Iran and Israel's friends coming to the defense of Israel. And whatever way you dice it, that's a world war. If you've got Russia, China, and Iran and the resistance movements throughout the Middle East on one side, and the United States, the United Kingdom, and I don't know, Belgium, Netherlands, Norway, although Norway would probably sit it out, on the other, then that is a world war. So this mayhem begins as soon as Israel decides, or America decides for Israel, to call it a score draw. If Iran and the resistance hit Israel in new ways, in more power and more different ways, and Israel then calls a halt, then we can escape this mayhem. But the greater the pressure on Netanyahu, it seems the likelihood is that he is indeed a mad dog that is out of control. Unless Blinken's there on a blind, unless Blinken is pretending to try and persuade Netanyahu to pull stumps, then the United States is going to be humiliated in front of the world when its client, whose bills are paid entirely by the United States, its client can tell it to go and do one. It's going to unleash mayhem and all the dogs of war all over the region. Let's go to Munich, where Abiha Karim has a question. Please, what's on your mind, ma'am?
Hi, I was actually wondering what is the general stance of the citizens in, for example, Russia and Iran, because I know that there are a lot of citizens who do agree with, who are against the Western hegemony and in general the genocide that Western countries are performing, but at the same time they're also against their government. So how prevalent is this mid ground, and what exactly is their stance, if you have any idea?
Well, I don't think there's any evidence that there are substantial numbers of people against their government, at least not on this issue. I would have said that Iran's integrity, dignity, and its honor is in play here. What Israel committed was a grave crime, not just against the Palestinian people, when they murdered the chief negotiator of the Palestinian resistance, but that they did it in Tehran when that person was there as a guest. Imagine if you invited a guest into your home and someone came in and savagely attacked them. I won't say killed them, savagely attacked them. It would be your honor that was at stake, as well as the need for revenge on the victim. So I very much doubt if there are any appreciable numbers of people in Iran who are not behind their government, at least on this issue. There are always opponents of every government and every system in every country. But in Russia, for example, all the evidence is that 80% of the Russian people are behind the Russian President Vladimir Putin. You see it in elections, you see it in opinion polls, including the opinion polls taken by Russia's enemies. There's no evidence that in Russia there is any substantial opposition to the general lines of the foreign policy, at least, of the Russian government. And it would hardly be credible if there were. The attack by NATO into Russia, in Kursk, has likely galvanized Russian public opinion behind their government. The murder of Hania in Tehran has likely galvanized Iranian opinion behind their government. And that's, I think, entirely logical. Let's go to Soweto in South Africa, where Bokang Selemakoro is on the line. What's on your mind, brother?
Hey, George Galloway.
Hi.
How are you doing? I'm a fan of yours. I know you have worked with Nelson Mandela. I wanted to ask, is there still civil society and activism in the Western countries that can stop and try to shift us from the nuclear war that is going to come?
Well, oddly, there isn't enough. And I say oddly because I have lived through times and been active in times where there was very much more civil society unrest over the danger of nuclear war. And I'm not entirely sure why that is. There's a mass movement in Britain against the Israeli crimes in Palestine. But there is no mass movement against the clear and present danger of a nuclear war that will knock even the Israel-Palestine conflict into a cocked hat, that will perhaps existentially threaten the existence of the entire human race. And it's quite hard to understand why I feel I'm the only person talking about this. We have an organization called No to NATO, No to War. You should look it up. You should follow it on social media and so on. But on the streets of Western capitals, with the exception perhaps of Germany, there appears very little in the way of appreciation of just how close to midnight we are with this doomsday clock. It's very hard to understand why. And so, of course, there is civil society in Western countries. Of course, there are many political forces, some of whom spend more time attacking each other than attacking the main enemy, but that is par for the course, as we say in golf. But that civil society is definitely not strong enough in the short term to call a halt to this juggernaut, which seems to be hurtling towards destruction. Thanks for that call. In Soweto, South Africa, it's a long time since I walked your streets, and it was nice to see you and hear you from there. The next guest is audio only. It's Dennis Chimino in Pomeroy, USA. Dennis, what's on your mind?
Hey, good afternoon, George, and this illustrious panel we have. I've had nuclear weapons responsibilities from my military days, and the issue about the world not being, trying to have a voice about the impending doom from a thermonuclear exchange. I don't really want to believe that. I think what's going on is that the suppression of voices by the Zionist control in all the governments, as one person said in the chat, that Starmer is cracking down. I've suffered unbelievable reprisals since I exposed, the murder of Palestinians in Khan Yunis back in November of last year. But to get on point here about the nuclear weapons, they require constant maintenance. Every 2 years, the weapons that I guarded on the nuclear-powered guided missile cruiser I served on for 5 years had to be shipped back to Pantex in Amarillo, Texas for refurbishment. And I haven't seen any evidence that the people in Israel at Dimona have a nuclear weapons maintenance program, and it's absolutely required. You can't just have nuclear weapons sitting on a shelf and then use them whenever you feel like it. They have to be disassembled and rebuilt because of the radiation damage to the circuitry that controls the triggering. So not saying that the nuclear weapons that Israel claims to have are not viable. I just think that in all reality, let's be clear here, that the United States of America provides the nuclear weapons umbrella for this country to exist under. And the B-61s that I think that Israel currently has in their inventory were provided by the United States. It hasn't got anything to do with this fake NUMEC thing where these brothers Shapiro in New Jersey shipped fissionable material to build them. The United States provided them with nuclear weapons probably many, many years ago. But I see no evidence that Israel has been able to maintain them. But having said this, as a person who has guarded them and actually had release responsibility on my ship as a key holder, actually had combinations and I had to get the weapons out. The issue with this is that the United States is a dying hegemon, and as such, it's a dying hegemon that this is a pinnacle moment in its life cycle, where it either has to maintain the hegemony or it has to not do it. And Israel is really not really, they are part of this, and they're a tool to try and goad Iran into to doing something severe, which they don't really have to do. Iran's winning this battle, even if they don't do another single move. But the problem,
yes, but they are going to do at least a single move, and maybe far more than that. Dying hegemon is, of course, a very dangerous beast, and one that's in a corner dying is even more dangerous. I can only pray and aid the president of your own country, It was he who conveyed to the government of Iran that Israel's response to the response may well include the firing of tactical nuclear weapons. That may be a bluff. Maybe you're right and they've all rusted from radiation sickness, but somehow I wouldn't like to bet my house on that. But thanks, that was a fascinating call from a man such as you, Dennis, and I hope you'll come back to the show sometime soon. Marilyn Hawes is author and CEO of Freedom from Abuse. Marilyn, what's on your mind?
Oh, thanks for inviting me. Thanks very much. Well, I want to talk about a completely different war, completely opposite to everything that anybody has talked about. So I'm going off-piste completely. That's okay. As a member of our English Parliament, as you are, what do you feel about misogyny? And I am talking about like the violence against women and girls as a global problem. So UNICEF figures are under 18, 1 in 20 girls globally are raped, and that is the number that we know about, and 70% never declare it. And the hatred of women and girls that is getting worse globally, is it terrorism? I mean, I don't think so. I know the reasons why, but I wondered, well, I believe I know the reasons why, because I deal with this a lot, but I wondered what your impression is and what you think of Yvette Cooper making it. To me, it's just like, well, let's just call it terrorism and that's it. Let's not look any deeper than that. Let's not try and sort it out. And it's not that difficult to see where these problems are coming from. But what is your opinion of that and that decision she's making?
Well, it may be off-piste, but it is a fascinating and highly valid question that you raise. I hate misogyny. As the father of 3 girls, and 4 girls as grandchildren, I despise it, hate it, and consider it to be akin to a mental illness. I believe that paradise lies under the feet of your mother, and that without women, of course, humanity would quickly die. So the idea of hating women is anathema to me. But I'm not comfortable, and I suspect you're not, at misogyny being defined as terrorism according to the sensibilities of a person who was a willing handmaiden to Tony Blair's assault, occupation, repression, and torture throughout the Blair era in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in black prisons, in Bagram Air Base, in Abu Ghraib prison. She, Yvette Cooper, was a part of the Tony Blair era and the Tony Blair war machine, and she's going to define what misogyny is? Is it misogyny if I tell you that Yvette Cooper is a national disgrace, that she should be on trial at The Hague? Is that misogyny, or is that me merely calling her out for her many crimes? Is it misogyny for me to say that Yvette Cooper is a parliamentary leper for these crimes, who should be shunned in all polite company? Am I saying that because she's a woman, or am I saying it because she was a part and parcel of a regime that caused murder and mayhem to cascade around the entire world, including onto the streets of our own country? I wish I had more time to dilate and expand on the many crimes of Yvette Cooper, otherwise known as Mrs. Balls, appropriately, as the wife of Ed Balls, another man who was absolutely intrinsic to the Blair-Brown machinery of war, occupation, and torture. Have I got time for one last word from Fra Hughes? Do I have time for Fra Hughes? Alas, Fra, you're going to have to forgive me, and we'll bring you back in the next show because I have overrun my time with the ire I felt for Yvette Cooper and her misogyny wheeze. That's all I've got time for. I hope you've enjoyed the show as much as I have enjoyed presenting it. And if you have, come back for Have It Out with Galloway next week at the same time in the same place. Thanks for watching.